I want to welcome everybody to the House Finance Committee room. Boy, this many people, you'd think we were doing a budget or something. Our lunch and learn today is a budget presentation by David Teal from Legislative Finance. This is an educational tool that we have. It's showing the fiscal reality of where we are and exploring scenarios to reclaim budget solvency. And as we go through this, he will point out to you different ways that he can put in other numbers and how it affects different things like our savings and things like that. So if you have any questions that you want to bring up and say, well, what if you do this? What if you have this much tax? What if you have this much more oil production? What if the price goes to this? He can put those scenarios in and it changes all these graphs so you can see the realities of what we're doing here. And David, I want to thank you for being here to put this on, and I want to thank everybody for being here. Again, this is just an educational thing to show you our fiscal realities of where we are and what our scenarios could be. We aren't advocating for any of these. It's just a reality check so you can understand where we are and what different scenarios will do. So, David, I'm going to turn it all over to you and eat my sandwich.
Sounds good. That's a big sandwich, too. Okay, thank you. As Representative Thompson said, this is an educational tool. It is or fiscal planning tool, whatever you want to call it. It's not new. Fiscal planning efforts have been underway for many years. We had a model back in the 90s that was much the same as this. The model is really not very sophisticated in the sense that all you're really looking at is a projection of spending and a projection of revenue and hoping those two balance. And if they don't balance, what can you do to make them balance? Whether you call that fiscal planning or sustainable spending or living within your means, or, it's been called a number of things through the years, it's kind of all the same. And the model has changed over the years. It used to be, where we had a table. Some people find those very easy to use, and others, the graph is much easier to see. Same information, it's just a presentation issue. So what we have here on the model is a projection of expenditures. And I want to emphasize that these are projections, not predictions. We have no idea what the legislature actually will spend. All we can say is that any projection we make is likely to be wrong, because what you spend depends on how much revenue you've got. Right now, this curve is declining, and we're starting here in 14. It declines because we've known for a few years that revenue was declining and have been ratcheting spending back. So in 15 there was a reduction, in 16 probably another reduction, and there are some small reductions in 17, and after that it pretty much flattens out. That's because the assumptions here are that the operating budget has zero growth. So we're completely flat, and in many people's eyes, those are reductions. It's because you're causing agencies to absorb inflation. So flat budgets, flat capital budget as well. And of course what you're trying to do then is say, here's our revenue stream or projected revenue stream. This is the projection done by Department of Revenue. We don't have any justification for modifying it, but certainly it's something that people can argue with. The problem from a fiscal planning perspective is that the revenue stream is below the expenditure stream, which means we're overspending. You can look at that and say, is it sustainable? And some people would say never. You may be able to overspend in the short term, but you can't do it in the long term. Well, the reason you can do it in the short term is that you've got reserves. This second graph below charts those reserves. If you don't have a reserve balance and revenue falls, you have no choice but to reduce expenditures quickly and immediately, or fully down to what your revenue is, because you can't, you have no money to spend. The reserves allow you to fill that gap. But of course, as you fill the gap, your reserves decline. So here, with large gaps, reserves are declining rapidly. And then as the gap gets smaller, the decline is shorter, and then as production declines and price actually goes up, I'll show you that in a minute, your reserves vanish. So some people would say this is not sustainable. We want to last longer than 2025. Lots of ways to look at this. One is to say, how do you join these lines? One is by cutting expenditures. Second is the traditional taxation methods: income tax, sales tax, motor fuels tax, those things that are pretty well established in other states. Third, you can look to other things, other revenue options. And there, some people will say, we don't have a problem. Not really, because we've got a gas line on the way. If you were to put a gas line in place, you can see that at some point, the gas line will produce revenue. And these numbers for the gas line, both the expenditures and the revenues, are from the fiscal note, which is now fairly old. But again, we don't have any information to update that fiscal note. So it's showing that we get a lot of revenue beginning in 23. That may be optimistic. I think people would now say that's 23 is unlikely. It's not going to be until 24 or 25 or even 26. But you'll note that the revenue curve did not remain flat, and that's because building the gas line requires additional expenditures. These are numbers off a fiscal note. I don't even know what they assume in terms of bonding and ownership shares and that sort of thing. All we know is that there is some general fund expenditure, and even with an early gas line, your reserves are gone before you get the revenue. Some people have said, well, we need a bridge to get to the gas line, various other things, but the longer this delay is, the more clearly you're going to run out of reserves. And as I said, once you're out of reserves, you have no shock absorber. If you have a gap, you must reduce expenditures. So we can back off on natural gas line, and then you might say this isn't that big a problem. You should be able to simply cut expenditures and fill that gap. The problem we see is that the revenues shown in this graph, you can hear the green is the revenue and the dark line is price. Price is red over on the right axis, the revenue is on the green. We've had a lot of revenue. It peaked at over $10 billion in 2008. What you notice here, I hope you notice, what I want to draw your attention to, is that revenue is not expected to return to the levels that we've seen since from 2005 through 2014. And that's with prices that we've never seen before. So again, official revenue forecast showing prices this year of $66, but going up to over $130. Even when prices were $140 in FY08, that was for a brief period. And you can see that the average price, even when oil was $140, has not been over $110. Now we're looking, according to revenues forecast, at an average price climbing to $130. So if you think this revenue forecast is optimistic, then you might want to rethink this revenue line. And here's where I'm just going to say, well, what does someone want me to put in there? We can go from $40 to, 150. Do 60. Okay. 60 is approximately where we are now. It's what many forecasters say you should expect for several years into the future. But again, change this as you like. At $60 oil, we're out of reserves in FY19. And I want to emphasize here that this isn't 4 more years or 5 more years of reserves. This starts in FY14. We're here in FY16. Basically, that's 1 more year of reserves, and then we've emptied. So we've got approximately 2 years of reserves left if oil remains at $60. The questions then are, so what do you do? How do you do this? You look at the 3 things I mentioned, how you typically can close a fiscal gap. One of them is reduce expenditures. It's what many people have said, that's all we need to do right now. We don't need to look at the revenue side. We will simply reduce the budget as required to get to a sustainable level. If you do that, and here I can show various reductions. If you want to take a negative 10% reduction, that affects K-12, and I'm just going to have it affect everything in the budget. 10% clearly isn't enough to close the gap, even out here in FY25, and it certainly doesn't extend your reserve balances very long. You're still out of money in FY19. So you look at this and say, well, how can I close it if I go to whatever, minus 12%, just to see? It's not important, I guess. What's probably most important is if you look at that level of reduction, and of course, that's not 12% this year, it's 12% every year. And let's look at what that does. Education, K-12, goes from a $1.3 billion program to $400 million program. Medicaid, $700 million program, goes to $200 million program. Agency operations go from $2 billion down to $700 million. So when I said in the overview of the governor's budget that it was very difficult to cut your way to a sustainable budget, this was the basis for that comment. I think that, I don't want to say it's impossible to make these reductions. I just would point out that a $400 million formula program is a third of what we're spending now. In fact, the entire budget would be dropping to a third of where we are now if you had 12% reductions year after year. And you still wouldn't have a sustainable budget, and you're still out of money long before you near that sustainable budget. So this line couldn't look like this. It would have to go to here and then drop another $2 billion to get to that sustainable revenue line. So,
David, Rep. Garrett has a question on this scenario you have.
okay.
David, this is something that's in the annual legislative finance guide you give to everybody, and you've got a line in there that if you fired every unrestricted general fund employee in the state, you still wouldn't come close to fixing a $3.5 billion budget gap. Could you show, I forget what you call that publication, but could you show from that publication's assumptions what it does to the graph in terms of cutting the budget deficit?
Sure. This is the little chart from the overview publication that Representative Guerra is talking about. It's a slightly different view of it, but these are items that are in the operating budget right now. We've got a revenue of current year budget is $2.2 billion. And if oil is at $60, it basically stays at roughly $2 billion. So if we look at this chart, it shows you that if you've got $2.2 billion to spend, then K-12 at $1.3 billion, Medicaid at $700 million, and debt service, which you can't avoid, consume your entire $2.2 billion that's available. That's before you hire or you have any state agencies, any employees, and of course, I should explain that this is general funds only. Federal funds may still roll into the state. They pay a lot of state employees. There are some agencies like banking and insurance that run off program receipts. So when I say no state employees, no agencies, it's probably oversimplifying. But the point is, there's no general funds left, and most of state employees, most agencies are run largely on general funds. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, only could you go to that graph that shows the gap between revenue and, yeah, the top one in the top left-hand corner. So if you were to cut all unrestricted general fund, state-funded employees, how far would that red line go down this year?
This year?
Yeah.
Well, again, assuming you've got to pay debt service, retirement assistance, production tax credits, and Medicaid, which is an entitlement program, your money's gone again. So you wouldn't have any agency spending, and you would have to drop all the way down here. I don't know if you were saying, can we reach here? Not without essentially having no government.
Meaning no state troopers, no DOT.
No corrections, no prisons, no
prison
correct.
guards, all of those.
Yeah. But of course that isn't workable. And so as a practical matter, you simply cannot cut your way to a sustainable budget. Certainly not quickly enough without economic impacts. I mean, I think we're all concerned about the Treasury and what this means for the state Treasury. But what this means for the state economy is a lot bigger issue than what it means for the Treasury. And as you make the massive reductions that would be required to get to a sustainable budget, the economic impacts would be much, much worse than they were in the 80s. And for those of you that remember the 80s, it was population fell, construction virtually stopped, and housing prices lost a lot of value. So the economic impacts are much more severe than simply losing your job. Even if you're fortunate enough to have a job under the economy that might result from jumping all the way down to the revenue line, their home prices would drop. But then you can also argue that, well, yes, but if all those people leave, Medicaid and K-12 and those other programs wouldn't have to spend as much. The model's simply not sophisticated enough to bring those kinds of things into it. We just say, there's a gap, you try to fill it. It can't go on and talk about the economic impacts, what might happen to housing, what might happen to employment. And you'd have to know what happens to population before you could say, here's what we need to spend on Medicaid or K-12. This is not sophisticated enough to do that dynamic modeling. So, again, one avenue is to try to cut your way out. The second way to close the gap is the traditional taxing methods. And you can turn on, I don't know, do you want to leave these at 0? And just say that at least that gives you a target. I mean, I could leave cuts in. I guess it depends on what you want to do, what others want to do.
That way with different increases we can,
Okay. So here, if you put on taxes, and we started with motor fuel. Right now, the motor fuel tax is 8 cents. We said, well, you could go to 16, you could go to 24. Did you see that jump? There you go. Watch that blue line. Now, other taxes can make a much bigger impact. We've got income tax scenarios, 10%, 20%, and 30% of, this is of your federal tax liability. There are other ways to tax. This is just one of them. What this means is if you're paying $30,000 in federal taxes now, and we implement a 30% income tax, you're going to pay $10,000 to the state as well as to your federal tax. So basically, 10% generates about $300 million, and you can go up from there. Sales tax, 1% tax generates about $100 million, and you can just multiply that through. So if we were to have a sales tax of, let's make it big, 3%, it closes the gap. But income tax, if you tried that even at a relatively high 30% tax rate, you still got well over $1.5 billion annual deficits. You've now stretched your reserves out from FY18 to FY20. But that's still a very rapid decline in reserves that it's simply not sustainable. So you've now tried two methods, expenditure reductions and the traditional methods of increasing your revenue. If they don't work, then the way we look at it is you have to look at other options. These options are nothing new. Again, they've been discussed since the 90s because this problem that Alaska faces now is nothing new. We have been a boom and bust economy for many years. It is, in fact, why we have a constitutional budget reserve account. Before that, we had a statutory budget reserve account. It's because if you don't have a reserve account and your revenue drops, and it does drop every time oil prices drop, and oil is a volatile commodity, so we have to live with the fact that our oil revenue is going to fluctuate. As it fluctuates, it's great in a good year, you have more to spend, but many years ago, legislators and others said, you can't spend those peaks. You have to save it because there are going to be troughs in revenue, and you need those reserves to fill those revenue troughs, or we're in trouble. Government just doesn't operate very well on a, okay, let's run a program this year, oops, it's gone next year. Ooh, now we got revenue back, let's hire those people back. They're not necessarily going to be available.
David?
Yeah.
You're showing this at $60 oil?
Yes.
Show what happens if you go to $90, if they happen to go that high, which I don't expect it to, but show the difference there.
Still a gap. But a gap that, you can live with that gap. And I'm basing that on reserves are declining, but not rapidly.
Pull the tax out now and see what it looks like.
So you can see that legislators and all Alaskans face a pretty tough problem. It's not easy to fill that gap. I should probably mention on revenue, this is a sensitivity chart, and as you're here, you know, when you put in a price of $90, I guess you could look at this. Let's just change $10 from 110 to 120. That's a movement of about this far. Well, from here to here, you've got $1 billion jump in revenue for a $10 price change. But as you're down in this part of the sensitivity chart, look what going from 50 to 60 does. It raises revenue maybe $200 million. We're on the flat part of the revenue curve, and we will be on the flat part of the revenue curve until you get to about $80. So when we put different amounts in here, if I put $40 oil in, it's not going to change much if I go all the way up to $70. It moved about $500 million with that large change in prices. If I'm at 100 and I go to 110, that price changes, the effect of that price change is much greater. But again, the purpose of this model is not to say, let's hope for high oil prices. The purpose is to say, what if oil prices aren't where we hope they are? And, you know, we can say, let's just put a 70 in there. We've seen that income tax and sales tax cannot close that gap. So then you get into the other things, and here you get, can't help but mention fiscal policy. We've gone through this about 6 times in the past, enough so that I think the options are pretty well known, and in fact, I would say that the people who lived through the 90s here, when in early 2000s, if you ask them what fiscal policy means, they would tell you that's political speak for we're going to slap you with an income tax and take your dividend. And I think that gave the whole fiscal planning a bad name. I think we do need to plan, but I wish I could tell you that there's some new idea here that no one has thought of in the past, and there's a way to fix all this. It's not true. As far as I can see, your fiscal planning options still are reduce expenditures, rely on your traditional methods of taxation, or turn to permanent fund earnings. And those are the same 3 options that have been discussed time after time during fiscal policy discussions. So if you turn to that 3rd option, because we've tried 2 of them here, I'm going to explain the options first. The most talked about option for using permanent fund earnings was the 50-50 split. There were others, 40-30-30, and various combinations. But what that really means is you would take the permanent fund balance and say it's going to earn 6.15% according to the permanent fund. Therefore, about $3 billion plus available in earnings. And then you treat it like an endowment instead of the way we do now, where earnings simply accumulate in an account. We would have a payout from that endowment equal to some percentage of the balance of the fund rather than simply looking at earnings. Yes, the earnings reserve account and the permanent fund. So here you're looking at a balance of 53 million, but the 5-year average of those is about 46 million. And then typically what they said was a 5% payout. So we used that. That would generate $2.3 billion. Now, it doesn't say what you do with it. It just says that's the amount the endowment would spin off. Now you get into what used to be called POMV, percent of market value. And then how do you use that? Well, the plan was 50% goes to dividends and 50% goes to the general fund. So we can go ahead and try that, and that's the 50-50 split. And if oil's $70 and if you've got a big income tax, that fills that deficit. But as soon as you start saying, well, take away even the sales tax, you've still got a deficit. Now, we started looking at this and saying, well, we've got a problem with the 50-50 split anyway. Recognized it's not a new idea here, but it's the same problem that exists right now with dividends. They're disconnected from whatever the legislature does. The legislature can tax or spend less or do whatever, but it doesn't affect dividends. Dividends depend only on the return that the permanent fund makes, and therefore the balance of the permanent fund. So people who want to preserve their permanent fund dividend don't have any real incentive to say, I'm going to watch what the legislature does, both in terms of spending and taxing, because if all I really care about is my dividend, it's not affected. We thought that there's another problem. At a 50-50 split, you're giving the general fund 50% of that endowment payout every year. What happens in those years from 2005 to 2015 when we had multi-billion-dollar surpluses, and you're just adding to the surplus by continuing to pump in the permanent fund earnings? So we started looking at a variable split that depends on a couple things. One, it would never give you more than you need. In other words, if you've got a surplus, none of the permanent fund payout would go to the general fund. The split can go to the dividends in different ways as well, so that your dividend becomes actually connected to what the legislature does. And if there's a multi-million-dollar capital project out there, people could say, wait, you're spending $100 million, that's going to reduce my dividends now and in the future by this much money. If you tax me, that's going to generate more revenue, reduce the gap, and therefore increase my dividend. So the way that works is same permanent fund balance, same earnings, same payout, 2.3, same as up here. Now the issue would be, what do you do with it? And we look at this and say, well, that depends on how much of your expenditures are covered by the amount of revenue that you have. We simply compute that and say, well, here we are with $3.3 billion of revenue and a $5.6 billion budget. That's 59%. So how much goes to dividends? And here, this is sample only. I mean, you'd have to have a law or some formula that says this, but we say, if you're covering less than 50% of your budget, your expenditures, then you don't get any dividends. But we also overrode that and said, yeah, we want a 10% payout. In other words, of the 5% that's paid out, 10% of it goes to dividends 90% goes to the other. Now, as you pay for more and more of your expenditures until you reach 100%, which means your deficit is eliminated, then your dividends go back up to 50%. But again, this table is for illustration only, but as it works, at 59%, we'd say dividends get 10%. That's $230 million. There is $262 billion that would go to the general fund. In 17, with the assumptions we've got in the model, and this is going to change every time you change any of your inputs, taxes or expenditures, we're going to say, well, now you're covered at 63% of your budget is funded. So we get more money going to dividends. And we'd also say, well, there's $2.1 billion available for the general fund, but the deficit is only 1.9. So the general fund doesn't need any of it. We're going to put it nowhere. It just goes or stays in the permanent fund. So the permanent fund would retain $169 million. And you could see then that what that plan does is balance your budget, first off. Your reserves would be growing, but your dividends are substantially lower. This
But
line...
you take the 30% income tax out, what does that line look like?
Well, let's look at it. First, here is what dividends are if you do nothing. Here's what they would be under a 50-50 split, and here's what they would be under a variable split, as it's set up now, but you can change that variable split. If you take the income tax away, then your dividends are going to be the minimum, 10%, and you still have a gap. But you're okay here. If you, change things, if you wanted, you could say, well, I want a minimum dividend of $800 or $500 or whatever. You can see that that causes reserves to go down because you do not have enough flowing to the general fund to close that. You could then say, well, maybe I don't want to pull just one lever so hard, because what I've done now is hit only permanent fund dividends. Permanent fund dividends and income tax hit different people in very different ways. Most of the people in this room would be far more affected by an income tax than they would be by loss of your permanent fund dividend. But if you're a family living in a rural area that relies on your dividends and those of your kids for 50% or more of your family's cash flow, that reduction in dividends is a big deal. So you may not want to use only one lever. You've got many levers available to you, and you might say, well, what if we did an income tax? Then, well, you don't need one that large. Would a 10% income tax work instead of 30? Small income tax, sizable reduction, basically cutting dividends in half, gives you one solution. But again, all you're trying to do is say, in general terms, what does this do for us? It's not saying that, hey, a 10% income tax and variable split works. Pass it, problem solved. Because we have no idea where oil is going. We've got oil here at 70. If we put oil back down to $50, the problem is not really solved. But if oil goes up to where it was at one point, 105, then you've got enough money coming in to balance the budget, build reserves, and your dividends are going to be fairly close to what they would be under the current plan. So there are lots of variables here, and They don't give you solid answers. They just let you know what moving those levers can do to your reserve balances, to your permanent fund dividends. Here's your various permanent fund balances. But again, the most important point of the tool is trying to close that gap so that we have reserves and don't have to cut to, like the early graphs we showed, where you're reducing education to 1/3 of what it is. So if anybody has anything they want to try, I'd be happy to put it in here.
David?
Yeah.
Go to the public first, Jeff.
Pardon?
Go to the public first.
This is based off of current throughput. With the throughput changes, is there a way to reflect that on the model? If the price stays the same, but throughput changes?
There is, but right now we've got that grayed out because the only forecast we're looking at is the Department of Revenue's official forecast. I've talked to the Department of Revenue about this. They are going to, I guess, take this graphic representation of things as a base, but they will undoubtedly make this model more sophisticated. Their model can probably handle a couple different production scenarios, but we don't have any production scenarios. Department of Revenue does, but we wouldn't know what to change. I mean, we could say, well, let's put something in there that production falls, but why and when? But I think Revenue, when they release their model, will be able to model those things.
Other scenarios you'd like to see? Increase in taxes or whatever, right there.
I just have a question. Is there any sensitivity to losing our retirees on income tax? Is there any way to model any of that if the income tax would be too high? Some of our...
No, the model addresses only the revenue and expenditures. You know, to go out and say this many people would leave, this many jobs would be lost is way beyond the capabilities of this model. We've talked to ICER about taking the output from this model and using it as input to their model so that we can see those economic effects. But we haven't gotten there yet.
I do know that Co-Chair Newman has had ICER look at and give him or working on some scenarios possibly that Jeff might even have from his office that talked about, okay, if we reduce the budget this much, this many people are going to lose their state jobs. What is that going to have for an effect on the communities around the state? And those numbers and the devastation of having, 2,000 state jobs go away, what's it going to do to all the communities around, in different areas? Hard to get because you don't know how many people would be laid off in a rural area compared to Fairbanks, Anchorage, or Juneau. But those are some numbers that have been toyed with, and I don't have a real answer for you there, but it's something that we've been worried about, is the effects on the economy, and we don't want to crash it.
This shows the governor's 75%, like 75% of the government, or is this
75?
like saying like what would the government look at 75%?
25% cut.
25% cut of government. So.
No, but you could get there. I mean, how long do you want to take to get to 75 or to 25%?
Can you repeat the question, please?
I was asking if the graph showed the 75% that the government was calling for in 2 to 3 years of government spending.
Well, yes, you can, but the easy way to do that here is to say, okay, so you want a 25% reduction over a period of
3 years.
And we say, no, once you put this in at 3%, it continues to cut at 3%. Again, You could have a model that's more sophisticated that allows you to say, well, what if we cut 10% this year, 8% this year, 3% this year, but this is just make it smooth. Don't
simplify it, say like 10% every year for 3 years.
But we can't do just for 3 years. If you take that, it's going to do this. So I can do this and say, well, if you took 3% cut every year, that's going to, for roughly 8 years, that's going to get you that 25% cut. It just takes longer to get there. And, you know, what this shows is if you cut that stream, you would actually, under this scenario with the variable split and income and a small income tax, you'd actually be in a surplus and your dividends would increase. If you said, well, don't want to have income tax, then you're back to a balanced budget, and again, dividends fell when you take away that revenue. So it's really this variable split of permanent fund earnings that balances the budget. And that's a simple conclusion from the first two statements, which was you will not be able to cut your way out of this without cutting to about a third of where we are now. And traditional revenue measures can't close the gap either. So if you look at that third leg, using the permanent fund earnings, then you can close the fiscal gap, reduce expenditures, basically maintain permanent fund dividends at about where they are, and be building those reserves back up. That's at $105. But then you look at, can we really expect that? What if it's 70? What happens is it will first balance your budget at the expense of dividends, because the split will change.
David, you have just 0 and then 10% income tax, and I'm just wondering if there's a reason. Is it not worth evaluating smaller percentages, or, you know, what the rationale behind those numbers?
The rationale was we got the numbers from the Department of Revenue, and those were the three options we had. But, you know, here you could put basically any number you want in there. 10% generates 300 million. 20 generates double that, 30% double is triple that. So if you wanted a 5% income tax, it'd be $150 million.
Right, yeah, so it's about 30 million per percentage, it looks like that.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Garrett.
Actually, unless there's any other questions from out there, you should go first. David, so obviously we all have different philosophical bents, and we've all got to figure how to talk about this together with the public. But what if you didn't, I know Representative Hawker has his POMV permanent fund bill, but what if you didn't do permanent fund or income taxes, but you used the state's forecast for oil prices, which nobody's forecasts are right, is my guess. What if you use the state forecast for oil prices and you came up with $800 million in addition in oil taxes instead? I'm one that's not so thrilled to see us spending $500 million more in oil credits than we get back in production taxes the next 2 years. So if you added $800 million in oil revenue.
Okay, so I'm going back to basically a no growth but no cut expenditure, and going back to no split. So there we are with the, I think we're now back to the base model, which was flat expenditures in the DOR forecast. We can do that by saying, let's put in, you wanted 800 here?
Let's try 800, yeah.
Okay, and then all we did there was say, we call that gains from indirect expenditures. It doesn't really matter, you can call it anything you want, but we now have an $800 million revenue bump every year. So it would fill the gap at DOR prices.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's academic, as none of us agree right now, right, that they're all going to be easy.
David, let's go back to the base scenario that $60 oil. Let's say that we've cut the budget down and it's flat from here on because we know we have increases coming, so we can hold it flat. There'd actually be a decrease in there would be no growth. Where does that show that we're going to run out of money at if we just do nothing else? We don't put any taxes in, we don't do anything with the permanent fund? We run out of money when?
That's in FY19. But remember, when we say run out of money,
right,
this is budget reserves, the CBR and SBR only. Now, when those reserves run out, you have more options. I mean, one option is to say, well, our reserves are gone. We now have to cut $2.3 billion from our budget and keep it out. Or you can say, well, we've got the earnings reserve account sitting out there. It's got $7 billion in it. So
But if we use that earnings reserve, once we have our savings gone, that would mean there would be no dividend check for anybody in order to balance our budget?
If you keep going on this path, what it means is the SBR and CBR are gone by 2019, but you've got a $2+ billion gap here, and that's with that 800. So let's turn that off and say you've really got a $3 billion budget gap, and you've got almost $8 billion in the earnings reserve account, plus the public education fund, plus some other endowments that you could use. So effectively, you have money that might last another 3 years, but once the earnings reserve is gone, and you're continuing to use that money, then dividends would pretty much have to go away.
Other questions or scenarios you'd like to see? Yes.
Are those budget reserve numbers, are those at the beginning of the fiscal year, or at what point in that fiscal year are they?
Those are end of fiscal year.
End of fiscal year.
That first column he has there, you see the red portion at the bottom, that was the statutory budget reserve that disappeared that year, and you don't see it from there on out. And the CBR is the blue line. David can plug in other scenarios for you if you want to get a hold of him, and if you got an idea of something you'd like to see. It's an interesting, you pull levers and it's the whack-a-mole, you do this and something else pops up, and you do that and another one pops up, and there are a lot of unintended things that happen when you do certain levers that you pull. So this is available. This is an educational type tool that we hope that will make the wheels start turning in your head. And we wanted to make sure that everybody realized the fiscal situation that we are in, and without some drastic change, we are going to have more major problems than we have today. Oil prices could go up. Nobody expects that. They could go down. I've read a couple of reports they could go to $25 a barrel. That really would change things. So this is something that we wanted to just get out so that everybody could see the different scenarios, the different possibilities, and get a grasp on the reality that we're actually looking at. Representative Sadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, Dave, do you have from the fiscal summary what we'll call the 25-year look back that shows the big bulge in GF spending? I think as part of the general public discussion of state finances, a lot of folks look at that 10-year, 25-year trailing expenditures of state, and that kind of sets the foundation for a lot of what we're looking at in the future. Do you have that available to show us?
I should, but I don't know.
And the reason for that is I know a lot of folks in the public look at that and make the assumption that, well, there's this huge bloated state government, that if we just cut it down to historical levels, this problem would go away. I'd just like to address that if you could.
Try that. I don't think I have it on this jump drive.
Or what don't you have on there?
Yeah. That one. But I know what you're saying, and that chart is in the overview, and actually there was one that was in real dollars or one in nominal dollars, and then one that was in real dollars per capita. And what that shows is that the current level of spending in real per capita dollars is roughly what it was in the 80s. So,
80 plus inflation.
yeah, it's adjusting for inflation and adjusting for population growth. The current budget is roughly the same as it was during the 80s.
Which surprised all of us. So I want to thank everybody for being here. If you have more questions, you want to stick around here for a little while, you got some time before you have to run off to a 1 o'clock meeting, you can come forward and talk to David and have him plug in some other scenarios for you, and you can get a good look at this and get a feel for what we're doing here. And I want to thank everybody for being here. Again, this was just to show you possible scenarios of where we could end up in the future and how we survive. Thank you again for being here.